For more on that story, we have with us Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So if we just recap briefly, Biegun has revealed that after his trip to Seoul this week, he will help review Washington's policies towards humanitarian assistance to North Korea, as he says some humanitarian organizations have expressed concerns that the sanctions on North Korea have occasionally, if we quote him, impeded aid into North Korea. Now, I understand that humanitarian aid is meant to be exempt from international sanctions on Korea. So, I mean, what have the problems been so far?
Right, so humanitarian assistance in and of themselves is not a problem. But on the disbursement of those aids, you necessarily require people on the ground. So there are travel restrictions in place for that. And there's a review process that the person needs to go through and get validated by the State Department in order to be on the ground in North Korea. And then the second issue has to do with fund transfers within the country while those aid workers are there, which is again subject to potential sanctions violations. So again, on both grounds, you would have to get on a case-by-case basis a review by the State Department to get approval and validation for that work. But it's been a little bit more difficult than in the past in order to get that approval. And so part of what this announcement suggests is to try to streamline that process in order to make it easier for the aid workers to go in the country and do what they need to do.
So I understand as well there's been, one of the reasons this has been so difficult is because also there was, apart from the sanctions, there was a travel ban that was issued on all US citizens, which makes it very hard for them to be allowed into North Korea. He seemed to imply that this process will also be reviewed when he returns to Washington. But he also seemed to imply that it was sparked by the case of a US citizen who was detained in Pyeongyang for a month back in October for illegally entering North Korea. I mean, what do we know about this incident, and what is the current situation with the travel ban for Americans?
So this particular individual who's from Louisiana, I believe his name was Lawrence Byron, if I'm not mistaken, tried two ways to get into North Korea. Once through the demilitarized zone from South Korea, and he was detained for trying to do that. Obviously was unsuccessful. He tried to go in through China this time and was detained by the North Koreans, and he claimed that he was sent by the American government to try to get the North Koreans to engage in a peaceful dialogue. Again, it's not clear what the intention was there, but he was detained for about a month, and he was expeditiously taken out of the country with the assistance of the Swedish embassy. So this, in many ways, is a different kind of scenario than what we've seen with someone like Otto Warmbier, who was detained and then, subsequently had some medical problems while he was being detained in North Korea for a very prolonged time. So I think that the U.S. is looking at this as a goodwill gesture on part of North Koreans, and that the State Department is thinking twice about whether or not the travel ban is really necessary if the North Koreans are willing to cooperate in this way.
As you said, the American citizen was returned very quickly, considering past experiences that we've had with North Korea and American detainees. Biegun actually called it expeditious and with great discretion and sensitivity through diplomatic channels. He also said this step gives us greater confidence about the safety and security of Americans traveling to North Korea. So this is quite encouraging that it seems that North Korea is also making goodwill gestures to the US, and the US now seems to be taking some sort of reciprocal step as well.
Right, but we have to understand that this was right before the talks were called off in mid to late November. So this was when still things were going very smoothly. We're at the current situation that we're in when the North Korean Choi Sun-hee counterpart Kim Young-chol decided not to show up in that high-level meeting late November as it was scheduled, and we're kind of in a sort of in a limbo at the moment, and the talks are somewhat stalling. If not, it's on hold. I think that's the correct characterization from the State Department, that State Department is waiting for the North Koreans to tell them when the next talk will be, and if so, where. Again, this is all of this development happened before that incident. So to some extent, I would take it with a grain of salt and say, yeah, these were good developments, but I wouldn't overestimate what these developments mean for the talks moving ahead and current situation that we're in.
I mean, that was going to be my next question, because the humanitarian situation in North Korea is very dire. So having these kind of humanitarian aid efforts would be beneficial to North Korea. So wouldn't they take this sign that the US is reviewing their policies to allow more humanitarian aid to come in? Wouldn't that encourage North Korea to come back to the table for denuclearization talks?
I would hope so. And I think a lot of people, including the State Department, is hoping that the North Koreans will take this as a good sign and respond in kind. But the fact of the matter is North Koreans have not made any demands of relaxing sanctions on humanitarian assistance in particular. If we've heard any messages through third-party channels or through other government officials from other countries, namely one is South Korea, is that they would like a broad loosening of sanctions on many fronts, not just in humanitarian assistance. And so I'm not hopeful that they're going to respond, but again, it is meaningful to some extent, and I think it's a meaningful gesture on part of the United States to show North Korea that they're willing and ready to make the necessary concessions to get the North Koreans to the bargaining table, and that they also want to take a moral high ground on these kinds of issues, and they don't want to be unreasonable on these humanitarian issues as well.
Some on the other side might argue that this review of the travel ban and the policy on humanitarian assistance is Washington softening its stance on sanctions. Would that be going too far?
Yeah, I think so, because, you know, if you listen to Steve Biegun's announcement, he's very clear that this applies only to American organizations and NGOs. So what about other NGOs and other governmental organizations, perhaps? We certainly have a lot in South Korea. It seems to me that this review does not apply to these other cases. And so again, it's limited in scope, but nonetheless, and it means something. It's a token gesture, but again, I wouldn't read too far into it to say that the U.S. is willing to go another extra mile on this. So how the North Koreans respond in the coming days, I think, will be critical in seeing whether or not we're going to get any progress, and the Americans willing to give more to get the North Koreans to do more on their side on denuclearization.
Before we move on from this, I also wanted to ask, the timing of Biegun's announcement, it was a little bit surprising, because he arrived in Seoul, landed at the airport, and he gave this prepared statement. And surely this is a matter that could have been announced by the State Department in Washington or in Washington. Why was it Biegun who decided to announce here in Seoul?
Well, first of all, Steve Biegun is the point person for negotiating with North Koreans, which means that this was a message to the North Koreans that the U.S. is taking moral high ground on this issue, and that they're willing and ready, stand ready for talks if Pyongyang is interested. So I think it's a very symbolic gesture, and it's coming from the person who's supposed to be engaging with the North Koreans, and it seems that, you know, he has no other channel, so he's using the channel that's available to him to convey this message. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he's making this announcement in Seoul, so this is not only a message for North Koreans, but it's also a message for South Korea too. You know, there's a narrative here, contrary narrative, that suggests that the Americans are not bargaining in good faith. And I think to some extent he wants to send a message to the South Korean allies that the U.S. is trying to be reasonable on these kinds of issues, and it wants to be a good faith participant in these talks, and that it's not going to be always about, you know, throwing down the hammer on the North Koreans with, you know, additional sanctions. That U.S. stands willing and ready to make concessions where it is reasonable to do so.
You've mentioned there that Biegun doesn't have any other channels to communicate with North Korea. It's quite interesting because he is the point man for North Korea, for Washington, but he's yet to meet North Korean officials and have meaningful sit-down conversations with them. What's interesting today, though, as well, there were reports that came out that Biegun went to the inter-Korean border today, to the DMZ, to take a tour of Panmunjom, the inter-Korean border village. That raises the question of whether, I mean, why he was there. I mean, they say he was there to tour the site and to see with his own eyes this important location. But do you think he might have tried to maybe hold some sort of communication with the North there?
Maybe. If he tried and he failed, then he wouldn't want to announce it. If he did hold a meeting, then he would like to announce that the talks are back on track and that U.S. is working diligently in order to move forward with this process. But clearly, I mean, I doubt that any level of meetings or discussions happened with the North Koreans. I mean, the State Department's position right now is that they are waiting for Pyongyang to get back to them on when the next round of talks is going to be. So, and in the meantime, Steve Biegun is out here on a working group meeting with the South Koreans to try to figure out what more can be done to try to get the North Koreans to come back to the bargaining table.
And let's move on to that meeting as well. So Stephen Biegun will be meeting his counterpart Lee Do-hun today and tomorrow, and they will be holding the second working group meeting as well. What do you think is on the table that they're going to be discussing, and what are they trying to get out of these meetings?
So one obvious item on the agenda probably is the South Korean demands and demands for inter-Korean cooperation. So South Korea would like to consult with the United States on these issues and to get the U.S. to work together with the Blue House to push forward in a meaningful way on the inter-Korean cooperation. So that's one issue. So they're probably exploring different ways to allow for this process to happen. And U.S. at the same time would like to coordinate with the South Korean counterparts and on keeping sanctions, meaningful sanctions in place, and to have that be enforced as it should be. At the same time, they want to talk about some of the diplomatic efforts that both sides could undertake to try to get Pyongyang to come back to the bargaining table, not later, next year, but sooner the better, earlier part of next year. So I think all of these issues are things that the working group is working on. But it also, having these meetings show both sides, both the United States and South Korea, that the critical stakeholders are working very, very hard and diligently on these issues, that it's not the United States and South Korea that's holding this process back, that they're doing everything they can to try to move forward with the talks. So again, and from a public diplomacy standpoint, I think it sends a really good message. From a policy standpoint, in terms of the content of those discussions, there are a lot of issues that can be discussed at this point until the North Koreans decide to come back to the bargaining table and engage.
Well, we'll have to see what comes out of those talks later this week. And that's we're out of time, so thank you for coming in as always and sharing us your insights.
Thanks for having me.